Thank you again for joining us for yet another session of the Enlister Summit. Uh, Most of you have probably heard about me. My name is Marlon Oliveira. I'm one of the members of the Summit Squad. I'm here to introduce Rachel Terry, who is Collections and Exhibitions Manager at Calderdale Museums. Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to follow Gemma's talk about 1830s fashion with a little deep dive into how we sort of get to that look that Gemma was talking about. So my talk, I'm going to just share my screen because I've got some slides for you. So so I'm going to talk about fashion and technological change in the 1830s, which is really the sort of how do we get to that look through the technology and what creates that really distinctive 1830s look. So the 1830s are part of a period of very rapid change in technologies of all types. And I'd like to examine some of the changes which had a bearing on fashion and also the things that changed how fashion was perceived and disseminated in the 1830s. So I'm going to look at the changes and innovations in fabric production and use some of the items from Calderdale Museums Collection, which I've photographed in some detail. So hopefully you'll get the experience of looking at them closely like you would if you were in the room. I do hope you can see them well on your screens anyway. Hopefully you can see the details as I go through. I'm going to talk about the changes in publishing, which including the rise of the magazines which feature fashion. And I know Gemma touched on that, so hopefully I can follow that a bit more and fill in a little bit about that. And then I'm also going to talk about the change in the makeup of society, which again Gemma touched on. It's the growth of the middling classes, and they have aspiration, they have disposable income, and that really helps to drive the engine of fashion in that period. So I'm going to take a bit of a dive into each of those things, starting with the changes in textile production. So we've got a lot of, in this period, we've got a lot of experimentations and improvements in lots of different textile techniques. In weaving particularly, we've got improved combing and preparing machinery. We've got the spinning process improves. Basically everything that makes up the weaving process comes on in leaps and bounds in the 1820s and 1830s, and it becomes more mechanized and more industrialized. Because of this, you start to get experiments and innovations happening in the textile mills, particularly looking at Halifax. Halifax and Bradford are very much a worsted spinning and weaving area, and they take over from other areas of the country by their use of innovation. They really start to develop new ways of working with textiles and new types of sort of different kinds of fabrics and different kinds of ways of creating pattern. There's also the experiments going on both in Halifax and in Bradford of new fibres in the mix, like silk, alpaca, mohair, cashmere. So they're not new fibres necessarily. People have used them obviously for hundreds of years, but putting them together in new ways, mixers are very new because there's something that you start to be able to do with these industrial machines. And in the area as well, in Brickhouse, we do have the beginnings of a really big silk spinning industry starting, and so you get a lot of silk and worsted combinations in Halifax and in the Halifax sort of parish area. We've also got the adoption of power looms, and that's where the looms, instead of being hand powered, they become mechanized. So that's the use of water power and then later, and then steam power and gears and pulleys to try and mechanize the process so you can actually find that people will run several looms at once rather than having one hand weaver working on each loom. You've actually got one weaver overseeing the process, and that actually, obviously, there's a downside to that, which is that it takes away people's jobs, and there are a lot of protests and riots which happen in this period as well. It's a much darker side of the story, which I haven't got got the depth to go into, but I will touch on again as we talk, and I can suggest some other places you can go and find that story, because that is a very important part of the story. But it's I'm talking about sort of the change and the innovations in this talk, so I'm not going to touch on it too much. So just talking about improved technologies and innovations, one of the key things that makes Halifax such an important area for these new technologies is James Ackroyd and Son. And Ackroyd actually is it's his grandson who builds Bankfield Museum, not as a museum, as a house originally. But James Ackroyd, his Edward's grandfather, started Ackroyd and Son in the early part of the 1800s, and he is a great he loves to try new technologies and new ideas, and he brings in, so the jacquard machine, which is a way of weaving pattern with a sort of it's a process where there are punched cards to form the pattern. It was invented obviously in France, the name suggests, by jacquard, but it doesn't really become widespread until the 1820s. And James Ackroyd is one of the first adopters of this technology. It's such an important sort of advance for him that all the other mill owners take it on as well. And by the 1830s, mid 1830s, every mill's using it. But he is definitely one of the early adopters and tries it out in new ways. So taking sort of commentary from the time or near the time, we've got a book called The History of Worsted Manufacture by John James, which was published in 1857, so not much longer than the period we're looking at. And he says that in the small interval between the years 1835 and 1838, there had been the most rapid and remarkable increase in steam power and hands employed in worsted manufacture. And he actually singles out Halifax. He says, to Halifax, the worsted manufacturer owes much for originating new articles and improving old ones. So he's picking out that innovative, really unusual approach that the Halifax manufacturers take, particularly the Ackroyds. And just to give you a little bit of context about how important the worsted industry is in the Halifax area, in the parish, so that's the pretty much the where Calderdale boundaries are now. They follow fairly well the parish of Halifax. So in 1838, in the parliamentary return, it lists there's 80 worsted mills listed, of which 50 are using steam engines. So they really are, at the cutting edge. 23 still have water wheels, which is the earlier technology. And there are 5,614 hands, so hands is usually the word for operatives in the mills. So they're the people working in the mills. And the population of the parish in that period it was just under 20,000 at this time. So really a quarter of the population is working in the worsted trade in the late 1830s. So it really absolutely threads through the whole of Halifax's story. And this relates to Anne as well, because Anne Lister's coal would have been used in the mills for these steam engines. I mean, it was used for lots of things. Different grades of it were used for different things, but certainly that was one reason why it was worth developing the coal on her estate, because there was a huge demand for it. Actually, I was really intrigued to find in 1837 in the diary that she considers building a building at Listerwick, which could use the steam power there and rent out spinning frames for worsted spinning. I don't think, as far as I can find, she doesn't seem to have carried out this idea, but it does linger on in the diaries as a possibility for really quite a long time, as something that she's considering. So the Bradford Observer talks about some of these new fabrics which are being produced by using the jacquard process, using different kinds of fabrics altogether, and they get called fancy figured goods or French fancies. They're not French at all. They're just inspired by France. And because France is still seen as the sort of capital of everything, beautiful, everything fashionable, they do get linked in with France, even though they don't. So they're often called French figures, is if you see them referred to at the time. And the Bradford Observer talks about them as being considerable demand for fine fabrics of a new description of goods lately launched, introduced to this market. Figures of varied, rich, and elegant patterns, which are expected to be worn for garments and ladies' cloaks this season. So they're picking up on the fact it's a very new trend, this jacquard woven pattern, but it is everywhere in Bradford and Halifax, and they are exporting their fabrics really throughout Europe, America, and Britain. So they reach a very wide audience. So I've put in, this is the book that I was just talking about. This isn't Ackroyd's. We don't have any early sort of sample books from Ackroyd's. We have later sample books, but we don't have anything this early. But I do have these sample books which are from J.T. Clay, who were based at Rastrick, which is just outside Brighouse. And they had a number of different mills within the family, but this one was particularly known for its very fine figured fabrics, its figured goods. And these samples here you can see are very small patterns, which would have been produced on a jacquard loom, and or loom with a jacquard attachment, I should say. And they are probably, most of these that you're going to see in this book are worsted with silk. So they're a combination of different fabrics that have been fibres that have been put together to create these very sort of glowing colours and really beautiful patterning. So this is another page from their book. So the book itself, we have a number of copies of books from their archive. There are some also in the West Yorkshire Archives Service, also have Clay documents and papers as well. And this one is, they're very interesting books because they're actually copies of their orders from the merchants that they would have sent the fabrics to. So they would have produced the fabrics, but they didn't market them directly. They would have been marketed through merchants who then worked directly with the sort of tailors and dressmakers, and also individuals could also buy from them. And they would have been based all over, Britain and Europe and America. So they're the sort of middlemen really that are reaching the markets for them. And these merchants have a lot of power in this period. They can really say to the manufacturers what's going to be popular, what isn't popular, what doesn't sell. They ask them to change aspects of the design. And they have this system called engagement, which I don't know if you can see on the screen here. It says about 2/3 of the way down, we've got two pieces, and a piece was 30 yards. So that's a piece of cloth has a particular size. Two pieces of CAHE's engaged diamond. So the engagement meant it was listed to that merchant. So those initials are standing for that particular merchant, and the diamond is that particular pattern. Obviously, this is a page of diamond fabrics, but what you will see, these numbers that you can see next to all the little samples, these are the manufacturer's numbers, design numbers. They're not registered designs as you might find later on, because registered designs don't really come in at this stage. They're just reference numbers for the manufacturer, so that the manufacturer, in this case Clay, can know which item that the merchant is talking about and wants more of. And they will have samples, so they will sometimes send a letter with samples attached, and then this is then stuck in. You can see actually this one has been stuck in the book. Obviously this order was actually cancelled, so it wasn't actually fulfilled. But it also shows the seasonality of the market, and this is something that really comes in again in the 1820s, 1830s. It's probably comes from the different seasons within society and the different events within society, but it becomes a much more general trend for people purchasing their fabric for making up into dresses and mantles and things. Um, because what happens is they have a period when they bring out all their new fabrics, and they have two a year. So there's the season in the spring. They have the spring fabrics, which actually they have to supply in sort of January time. It all feels very familiar to sort of modern seasonal trends sometimes. So they have to provide the merchants with their fabrics for the spring season, and you see these letters in these kinds of books where the merchants are saying, "You didn't send the fabrics in time, and we've missed the spring market, and we could have sold loads more." And they do like blaming the manufacturers for not doing it properly. And then in here, he also talks about the winter season, which is sometimes it's the autumn season, but again, it would have been people wanting to get, their winter garments ready. And again, that's the merchants are being supplied by the manufacturers in sort of August time for that. And then these are, I love this page actually. I think these are probably mantles or cloaks, because it is actually like a border design. It's on its side, I think, there, in the book. But you can also see where these books that we have are a sort of engagement with the manufacturer and the merchant about the different things that are being produced. So you can see that where they're ticked, it's usually where they've been ordered and how much has been ordered. But where there's a cross, it's often where the merchant has come back to them and said, no, we don't like this colour, or we want it in a slightly different design. We want something a bit different about it. And often there are it's like here it says lighter blue, and then talks about different lightness to the design. So it actually is interesting to see the sort of back and forward process between the merchant and the manufacturer and that's also helping this innovation and driving the changes in fashion at this time. This one I popped in for you because it actually is a really interesting page in that it shows some of the different kinds of fabrics that they're weaving. And this can be that they're putting different fibres together, or it might be the type of weave that they're using. So it might be a twill or a different kind of patterning that they're using. And here at the bottom half of the page, where it says 11th of March, we've got, can you see a range of different fabrics? They're more or less the same design, but just in different colorways and with slight variations. And it's got notes about the design numbers, and obviously they've changed that depending on. So they presumably kept these in production for a little while, whereas a lot of these seem to be in production for really quite a short time, and then new ones come along. There seems to be a lot of change in the a sort of mix, really. They like to innovate and bring in new designs. You can also see that there are suggestions for different. There's one here that says, just having a look. Yeah, the silk, and that's actually a merchant's name there, and he's saying that they've been sent those pieces that they've ordered. So it's kind of a combination of an order book and also their sort of ongoing monitoring of what's sent and what designs are licensed really to which merchants. This is a letter I've put in actually, which really shows the influence of the merchants on the manufacturer. So Kennelly and Bidford, which is at the bottom here, it says yours truly, Kennelly and Bidford. They were merchants based in Marylebone Street in London. And did actually find a record of them. Somebody actually stole some cloth from them, and so they're in the police records for the 1830s, having, giving testimony for how much this cloth was worth that was stolen. So we do know a little bit about them, who their names and things. But they were merchants with clays, and would have been merchants probably for Ackroyd and other mill owners in manufacturers in Halifax. And this is in April. They're writing back saying that we the new patterns disappoint. They never pull their punches, these merchants. And they say not the quality, so they like the quality, but they always want to change the design. And this is a common theme in the letters that you see in these books. And so they're saying, oh, we don't want the spot like this. We don't want it to stand out as much. We want it on a different ground. And they're saying that also the other interesting thing about this letter is they're talking about how they want the goods to be sent by coach, which is actually the fast way of getting your goods to market. So they're saying, speedy, please send us the samples, please send us the things we've already ordered. And we don't want them by canal because that's slow. We want them by coach. So they're going to, pay to have them sent by coach. So it's interesting. We haven't got the railways yet at this point. So that those are the two really alternatives. By road or by canal. I'd like you to just have a little look at this design down here. These design samples that they've got in here, and just hold in your mind this pattern with the little flower in the middle and the little squares there of silk. So this is probably silk and worsted, I think, this design. And then on the next slide, so that was in April. And then in August, you can see they've really listened to the merchant and what the merchant's asking for. And can you see they have done a whole range of different, same pattern, but a completely different color range. And they look so different. And these are the ones that they obviously sold in the autumn, looking forward towards winter ranges. And you can see actually that I don't know if you can see that, hopefully you can, it says wanted or much wanted. So they're actually recording, how popular these designs are in their order book as well. And this one I put a real close up in really of some of the designs because I really wanted you to see how slight the variation is between the different patterns. And I think that the manufacturers just came up with iteration after iteration on different themes and then see which one actually takes, see which ones take to market. But they had to really respond to what was wanted and try and please the popular taste. And I think these designs really show you those slight changes that they made, changes in color. Sometimes it's a change of a placement of a motif. Sometimes it's just like with these checks. I mean, you can see they're very, very similar, but they've just changed the size of the checks and how they're woven to give a slightly different pattern. So moving on to, so that was weaving, but there were also experimentations happening in dyeing and printing. This is much more in Lancashire rather than in Halifax, but it does also affect Halifax, and it is also part of what drives these changes in fashion at the time, because there are so many changes at this period in the dyeing and printing. So I'm just going to move the people at the side. Sorry about that, so I can actually read my screen. So we've got things like the availability of dye products, and really with logwood and fustic, these are dye products which have been imported from the Caribbean and the West Indies for actually really quite a long time. You see records of them coming to the country and being used as dye stuffs. Um, but they're used in new ways, really. They're used with other products at this time and with new printing techniques. So they move from the original methods of printing in the 18th century had really the main ways were sort of printing, usually wooden block printing, but also sometimes engraved plates they had moved on to. But at this point, at the end of the 18th century, you do start to get roller printing or cylinder printing. And these are wooden rollers, but they have copper inserts and sometimes felt inserts to actually roll the pattern. Obviously, when you've got a roller, you can actually print a lot more fabric much quicker. But in the 1820s and 1830s, roller printing becomes so sophisticated. You can print more colors and you can print them all at the same time. So they developed this machine where you can actually put all the cylinders in a sort of one after another, and then your fabric just goes through all of them. Obviously, the less processes you have, the less times you have to pass your fabric through a print process or a dye process. the cheaper you can sell your fabric because it's much less labor intensive. So the old blocks that you would print with a wooden block, you might have had 30, 40 blocks to make up a pattern because each part of the pattern, each color had a different mordant or dye that you needed to print and then print on top, or you might have needed to dye it in between as well. So it was a very long process. But roller printing is a lot quicker and it can quickly becomes more sophisticated. And they also then develop in the 1830s, particularly speedier ways of engraving the rollers. So they move from these wooden surface rollers to copper rollers, which are engraved by hand originally. And then they move to mechanization of engraving those rollers and steel mills, which actually give very fine definition on the rollers. And they could get lots of stippling effects and fine lines and quite lovely geometric patterns come in as well. So you can really tell that the patterns in this period really expand exponentially, really, the printed patterns. There's just such a variety because they have all these new techniques to create them. And actually block printing still exists, it still happens. It's much more high end and it's usually in furnishings or shawls, but it does still happen. That the old technologies don't disappear because they are very good, but these new ones are the ones that really make the money and make the quantity. In the background here, or on this left-hand side, I've also got John Ramsden's dye book, which is a little bit later, the 1860s, because that's the earliest one we've actually got in the museum, a dye book. But it does show, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but it shows the use of some of these dyes with newer dyes. So you've got alum as a mordant, which is a very popular mordant with madder, and the mordant helps it's called a mordant because it helps the dye bite to adhere to the cloth. And this is also dyeing it with fustic, which is the a tree from the Caribbean, which gives a very yellow colours on the whole, a range of yellows and buffs. And then also they dye with logwood, which is the other big dye of the period, which they often use in conjunction with madder, and they both give reds and purples and a range of reds and purples. And with alum and different mordants, you can, like tin and copper and iron, you can get a range of different colours, even with the same dye bath. You can actually have different mordants and you will dye it. You dye it in one dye bath and you will get different colours. So just to show you a few items from the collection that we have. So here we've got a silk dress, which is probably late 1820s, early 1830s. And I've just picked it out because it has a very innovative technique of printing on it called rainbowing, which means moving between multiple colours in a transitional stripe, and which can only be done with a roller. Okay, there isn't another way of doing it. So it becomes one of these new roller print techniques that's very fashionable. And here the rainbowing effect is on a silk, which actually has a self pattern already woven into it, which looks, I mean, the two together are quite almost quite modern looking, really. Obviously, I'm not showing you the rest of the dress, which gives you the silhouette, but if you just look at it out of context, you might not even know which period it's from. And we've also got, it looks quite, because it's quite a chaotic pattern almost. You think it's actually quite complex, but really it's a very simple, it's quite a small repeat. If you can see from this bit here to here, that's the repeat that way. And then here you can see the repeat here happening here across there. So it really is, in the weave, it's actually quite a small repeat. In the stripe, it's a very, very large stripe. So the two together give quite an extraordinary effect. And then this is another one from our collection. So this is another cotton dress rather than a silk. And this is a good one for showing the what I was just talking about, by the difference in the roller technology that came along, the cylinder printing. You can see in the sort of little flower, little sprig, that's actually quite detailed engraved pattern, and also in the wings of the sort of brown blotches, as it were. They're definitely an engraved pattern on a copper roller. But the blotchy bit, which could be some kind of buff of some kind. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's been added probably by a felt, so probably a felt insert in the roller to give you that effect. It isn't hand done, that one, because it does repeat when you look at it across. The same bits do repeat, so I think it probably is in the felts. But we have also got a hand done element on this, which is in the sprig. If you look at the sprig and these little leaves at the bottom of the sprig, can you see the blue does not line up with the printed leaf? And that's because the blue has been added in a technique called penciling, which is done with indigo dye. And indigo dye was really, really hard to print from because it's a vat dye and it has a totally different process to the other dyes. It needs oxidization to get the color. And it oxidizes very, very quickly. Once it reaches the air, the oxidization process happens and it goes blue before you can fix it on the cloth. So obviously dyeing it in a vat and dyeing something blue is relatively easy, but adding it as a print is really, really difficult. And they tried lots of different ways of doing it. But at this stage, they were still doing it by something called penciling, where they slowed down the process of the oxidization by adding something called orpiment. And orpiment you see referenced in the dye books, and orpiment is actually arsenic. And these poor women, because it was women usually, were adding in by hand with a paintbrush these bits of indigo to paint the leaves where they wanted blue or yellow. They might have yellow printed, and then they would put the indigo on top. And they were licking their paintbrushes to get a point, which is why it's called penciling. And obviously they were taking in the arsenic, so not a good profession, that one. But they do develop other blues and ways of printing blue. There's a process called China blue, which is actually it's indigo, but they find a way of actually processing it so that it actually prints. But it still uses orpiment, so it's still arsenic based. And then we move on to, again, in the 1830s, right through the 1830s, they're experimenting with colour. And the mineral colours which were produced at that time are actually metal salts, which were printed onto the fabric. And then a further metal salt was that they were put through another process with another metal salt, and then that would actually produce a chemical reaction, which gave you some very popular 1830s colour combinations. And depending on which chemicals you put together, you could get two colours for the price of one, really, because you only had to do one process with the third chemical, and you got two different colours depending on what you'd put on. So you get this iron buff and Prussian blue, which are a really, really popular combination in the 1830s. They do stay on into the 1840s, but you do find them very frequently, and they do appear a lot. And then other popular colours from this mineral process were chrome yellow, chrome orange, Shields green, which is another arsenic-based one, and manganese bronze, which is another really, really popular colour in this period. The buff colour on the previous dress may have been manganese bronze, but it may have been an iron buff. I'm not 100% sure. Manganese bronze can be spotted because quite often, if you look at fabrics from this period, if there are holes where those particular, so sometimes you get like a little leaf, and instead of the leaf, you've actually got like a little hole pattern that's the shape of a leaf. And that actually can be because the fabric's rotted away because manganese bronze was very acidic. And the same is true, actually. Can you see the this outline here in the black? So this could be chemical black, which is actually, it dates from old block printing days. It was around for a very long time. And that actually is an iron gall process. It doesn't require any mordanting, so it's a very useful colour for doing outlines. But again, it can be very acidic, and sometimes you will find the outlines of things have dropped out of the fabric and just rotted away. So that's the sort of story, really, of the textile techniques and changes and innovations that are happening, and also the way that those fabrics came to market. But what I'd also like to look at is the corresponding rise in fashion in magazines and the rise of ladies' magazines. And on the right here, you'll see this. This is from La Belle Assemblée from 1832. And it actually, you can see how much detail there is in the print of, in the fashion plate of the different garments. And hopefully you can also really pick up on some of those silhouettes that Gemma was talking about in her talk as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fashion in magazines and how that drives the innovation. So fashion plate, first thing is really to say that 1830s fashion plates, they'd been around really quite a long time at fashion plates. You get engravings as early as the 1770s, and this one on the left is from an almanac from 1775. And it's probably a wood engraving at this point, I think. And you can see there's a reasonable amount of detail in there, but it's it's got no colour. Nobody's added any colour to it, and you can't really see. There was usually no description of the fashion at that time either. It was just a plate that you got in your almanac. Um, then by the 1800s, you're starting to get fashion plates occurring in some of the ladies' magazines, and really there were only one or two at this point. The ladies' magazine is the most popular, and they produce them not on a regular basis, but now and again. So by 1801, you're starting to get them quite frequently, possibly monthly. And then we've also got hand coloration happening at this point. So all the colours in these, they're printed from, usually by this point they're probably engravings from copper, um, or usually copper, I would say at this point, and they are coloured by hand. So people would have put the colour in with a paintbrush. That was out piecework. It was done out of the publishing trade in people's homes. They had pieceworkers. But then just look at the quality difference between 1801 and 1820, and you can see the sophistication of the engraving is a lot more detailed by this point. Your color application is a lot more precise. And this is a beautiful one from Calderdale Museums Collection, and it shows the costume. I think the detail on it is superb actually, and it is actually an advertising one. This one, so they were sometimes done as advertising, and even again they would still probably be in the fashion magazines, the ladies magazines. So we do get a rise in new ways of showing off your items in the magazines. And one of the famous magazines from this period, which I'm sure lots of people will have come across, is Ackerman's. And it's usually just abbreviated to Ackerman's, but it's actually Ackerman's Repository of Arts. And this is an image from 1826. And it's one from our collection, but the magazine actually started in about 1808, and it really doesn't just show fashion. It actually is just the place to go if you want to find out about interiors, or you want to see what's fashionable in textiles. They actually have little samples of fabric in there, and it is absolutely the gold standard of engraving of the time, of hand coloring at the time. It has everything that makes you into a tasteful and fashionable person in all aspects of your life. So Ackerman's was really popular, and it spawns a whole sort of range of other magazines. So we've got things like La Belle Assemblée, which again starts quite that actually to start earlier in its sort of 1810 teens, but it actually really goes for quite a long time, and it morphs into different formats. So it starts out with a bit of fashion, monthly fashion plate, but it actually then really ramps up and becomes absolutely all about fashion. I mean, these magazines did have other things in. They had information about sort of things that you might go and see at the theatre. They might have court information, who was at court, who was going to different events, but their fashion becomes, especially in the 1820s and 1830s, fashion becomes the main reason about these magazines. And one thing about La Belle Assemblée is it's actually one that we know that Anne Lister comes across and did look at, but I love Anne Lister's quote about La Belle Assemblée. So she says, she mentions it in 1818 as having seen it at the light. She gets it out the library when she's hanging about the library looking for Miss Brown at that time. But she doesn't really say anything about it at that time. But then in January, 5th of January, 1819, she says that while some others were playing at quadrille, I sat by and skimmed over the notes of La Belle Assemblée for November last. Very stupid thing indeed. And I think that's just, it just really shows it wasn't Anne Listener's cup of tea at all. Um, she doesn't, I don't think she really would like it because it's very light. All the information is, apart from the fashion, is quite lightweight. The stories are quite lightweight, and it's not designed. I don't think it was really aimed. She wasn't probably a target audience really. It is about selling fashion and selling new designs. And here we've got the some of the worsteds and silks that I was talking about in these designs. We've got different examples of silks as well, and it shows the different sort of seasonality again of the designs. So the entrepreneurial publishers, they really are. They see a gap in the market that everybody seems to be buying these new magazines. They're the same magazines, but they've got more fashion in. So they go, oh, okay, well, let's do some that are just fashion then. So they start to really focus on fashion. And because they're putting in fashion every month, and they've got monthly plates. So they really start to drive the change in fashion and the change because not only are there fashion plates in these publications, but they also describe the fashion in great detail, and they are a they're a template really for you to say, okay, I think as Gemma said, you take your your design, you buy your fabric, and you go off to your dressmaker and say, well, I'd like it like this, but I'd kind of like the trim to be this one, and you can sort of mix and match. But these were guides to what was in fashion and what was not in fashion. So they're your template really for making sure that you look right for the occasion that you're wanting to create your garment for. And one thing about these magazines, a bit like the jacquards and the prints that were happening, they often get they need to be associated with France because France is the center of it's the epicenter of fashion at the time. And so they use the French have developed a really good way of engraving, and they actually the British publishers import wholesale those French engravings. They just reuse them and they mix them up and they reuse them and they just make use of them really, and then they pretend that they're French. So La Belle Assemblée, for instance, was produced in Britain, but it has a very French sounding title because obviously it's wanting to make it sound like it's French. La Folie is actually a French magazine of the time, and that's actually one of the original French fashion plates that then would have been lifted and used in other. I mean, they were licensed, but I think they were also pirated as well in some editions, and they were used in things like World of Fashion and other. You will see the same plate turning up, coloured differently because they're all hand coloured still at this time, but it is often the same person. You recognise the figure more than once. And then another one from La Belle Assemblée that we touched on earlier. And you can see the variety of dress in these. So you've got carriage dress, you've got morning dress, as in morning in the morning when you well, which is actually not actually in the morning, but you would go and pay your morning calls, which are actually in the afternoon. And then you've got on the left hand side, you've got dinner dress, evening dress, and ball dress. So you're showing the variety, and because there are so many publications at this point and they are publishing every month, you really have to, they obviously were trying to include as much variety as possible and really pushing the changes in dress, and the fact that you wore different outfits for different things, it really adds into that mix. And then we also have advances in printing, which is fashion plates in the text, which is a really big step forward. It's a different, instead of the plate being a separate page that's printed separately, hand colored and then inserted, they can actually print on the text with the text in the same on the same page. So it is an engraving, but it actually sits in the same printing bit of, they print from the same the same piece as the text. And this means they can absolutely up the number of fashion plates and images that they have in every publication. So suddenly you really proliferate. And I've just put on the right hand side of this slide, that's the header for this piece that's in here. It is so detailed. So you can go away and recreate that with your dressmaker, or you know what the fabric looks like, even though it's a black and white plate. You don't need to see the color because it tells you in the write-up. And then we have, I've just popped in a couple from La Belle Assemblée just to give you an idea of again, the proliferation of plates that they start to put in. And this is they start doing double plates where they have them facing each other. So they get, more fashion, even more fashion in. You have perhaps four plates where you might have had one for your monthly edition. Then you've got four plates of fashion for your monthly edition. And you're starting to get lots of details about this happens in earlier ones as well, but you get more angles of what the same bonnet might look like, or you might get different decorative trimmings or other things added into the picture. There is I think it's under my picture, under my window at the moment, but I think there's a very nice Ayrshire whitework pelerine up here, which is the sorts of things they would show how you put an outfit together. And here we've got the different kind of things that you might wear. So um, the actual write-up in the magazine would talk about the occasions when you would wear these different garments and the right place to wear them, and when what wasn't the right place. So then finally, the other aspect of change, which really it's bound up in all the other changes and it really drives it, it's the new markets. And in this sort of arena, you've got the growth of the middling classes. So you've got tradespeople, you've got industrialists, you've got merchants, you've got shopkeepers, you've got clerks that are all having more disposable income than they used to. And of course, you've got all their families as well. And of course, when you get this, you get lampooning of the new aspiring people as well. So we've got a George Cruikshank cartoon here, which I love, which is from the late 1820s, 1828. And it's like looking at this conspicuous consumption in quite a funny way, because he's looking at bonnet building. He puts in as if it's like building an actual building. It's so big that, you have to have ladders to actually erect it, and plans and things. And then he also says, well, if you can't fit your new enormous bonnet in your, in your carriage that you have to obviously have a bonnet carriage specifically to drive out in, because why wouldn't you? So it's mocking that conspicuous consumption that's happening at this time. And the men weren't free from this either. So they have something called The Whole Art of Dress, comes out in 1830. And this is about being elegant, being presentable, wearing the right things for the right time and in the right fabrics, but at the enormous saving of 30%. So it's all about trying to look better on a budget, basically. And that's again aiming at these aspiring classes. And then I just wanted to finish with some from the Ladies' Pocket magazine, which is showing you really towards the end of the period that we're looking at how it goes down the social scale, really, because these were much smaller. I've got one here, and they're really quite small books that were aimed at the less affluent, but who still want to dress well and want to find out about fashion. And you can see, I hope you can see from the image, that it's not as well engraved. It's much cheaper engraving. It's not one of the French ones. It's probably done in this country. And it's very quickly hand coloured. So again, not much money spent on the production of this, but they were about volume. But they still wanted to align themselves with France. So they have a French correspondent. They always show a London costume and a Paris costume every month. And they like to be they're quite didactic about how you should wear your dress, and they're telling you much more about what occasion, what's being worn where, and what occasions you should wear something on, and when it's right and when it isn't, because they're really aimed at people that are not really at that social level yet, but want to get there so that they can perhaps marry well, or they've inherited perhaps money, or from, through trade, and they want to present themselves as a different social status. And then here we have the Lady's Pocket magazine from July 1837, which I included because it has a really nice sort of link to the social history of the time. So Paris evening dress obviously is pink and frilly and has lace, whereas the London evening dress of the time, it's mourning, it's national mourning, it's the period after William IV's death and as Victoria comes to the throne. And that is written up fully in the magazine as to what you need to wear for mourning for your king having passed away. And so the instructions are given, as you need to follow them to make sure you fit in with society. So that's the sort of range of different things that I think really drive the change of the time. I hope that that's given you a little sort of glimpse into what sort of things were being produced in Halifax and how they kind of fit in with Anne Lister's world of the period and Anne Lister's women, because they would have been reading a lot of the women that she knew and had relationships with and friendships with. They would have got their information from these. I don't know how much, I'm not sure how much Anne Lister does get information from these guides. I think she obviously does want to try and make sure she fits in social circles, but I think she probably is of a level of society where she's taking advice from friends, she's going to dressmakers, she is in that world. But I think these are aimed very much at the Anne Walkers. I think Anne Walker would have been looking at these and using these as guides. So they're very illuminating about how societal change drives fashion in this period. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'm really happy. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm happy to ask any questions.
Thanks, Rachel. That was great. So we do have a few questions. So to start with, we've got a question from Liza, which is, was it a pain for the manufacturers to make those small fashion changes to the fabrics and things in like size and colour, or was that just a small adjustment that was actually quite easy to facilitate?
I think on the jacquard process, it probably was actually it was probably quite a complex process because for each design you had to punch your cards for, re-punch your cards based on the design that had been produced. But I guess once you'd done one variation of something, you could just tweak it and then produce, but you would have had to have produced a new set of cards to weave that on a power loom.
Ah. Again, kind of on the production itself, a question from the Pats, which is, how did the ink slash dye get on the rollers? Was it all handwork? Was it painted on?
Oh, that's a good question. It was in a bath, so the roller would come down. So they were like a sort of series of rollers, and then the dye baths would be underneath them, and then they would lower in and then pick it up, and then the fabric would come through and take the dye would come off. And the fabric had been, sometimes it was dye, sometimes it was mordant. So if the mordant was on there, then the dye would only adhere where the mordant was, and it would wash out where the mordant wasn't.
Mm. So another question from the Pats is, how did we acquire the Caribbean logwood and rustic? Was that to do with the slave trade? How did we get that?
Yes, it absolutely was to do with the slave trade. So it was one of the main imports of the time. So really from the 1750s onwards, you can see it in ships information, and it would have been harvested by enslaved people. So in the obviously in the late 1830s, it's after the period of emancipation, but I think even then it's still a trade which exploits people and is yeah, it's not a good side of the fashion industry at all, and it was used here in great quantities. There's a very good article actually by, I think it's Adam Bowker, Bowker, and he was looking into the mahogany trade, which was also another very exploitative trade from the Caribbean.
Mm.
And what happened was on the ships that were coming over with the mahogany, the mahogany was actually just the ballast. So the mahogany was weighed into these amazing furniture over here. But it actually was ballast originally. It just came over as ballast. And the main goods that were brought over were actually the dye stuffs and the logwoods and the fustics.
I've got one more question. So before I ask that, I just want to say if anyone else has a question, please do put that in the chat and I will get to that after this one. So this question is from Marlene, which is, Are sample books with the fabric samples something that private individuals would also compile for themselves, or was this more common among merchants and clothiers? And
Actually, that's interesting because we do know of sample books that people collected, and Anne Strasden has written a book called The Dress Diary of Anne Sykes, which is one of those sample books where
yes,
somebody has gone through her life and collected samples of. She's basically begged samples from all her friends and relatives of things that they wore, plus kept things of her own that she's worn. And there's another very famous one in the V&A, which is Barbara Walker's album, but they're not that common. Yeah, they're not sort of not the same as the merchants and the manufacturers would have had lots and lots of these, and they just had, they kept them for reference as well. And the other person who had sample books was dressmakers, and a lot of those sample books find their way into quilts, and quilts are a really good repository for some of those variations in designs, so you can really see there might be 10 colorways of the same thing in a quilt, and probably, only some of those would have really made their way into many garments.
that's great. Thank you. If anyone wants to know about Kate Strasden's book, it is very interesting. I've read that. I think Marlene has as well. It's a good book if you're wanting to kind of look at fabrics and how it kind of plays into people's lives. And yeah, it's
Yeah,
fascinating.
definitely recommend that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really good. So we are now going to head back into the breakout room. So that's your warning this time. It was a bit of a quick zap after after Gemma's session. Sorry, Gemma. But we're going to do that now. So yeah, we'll see you all again in the breakout room. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks.